In the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion, the player encounters many supernatural, mystical, and godlike beings as antagonists and enemies. These beings and entities have arcane and combat abilities that match that of the players, or even exceeds them. Yet, whenever a foe such as an underleveled bandit highwayman, or a marauder, confronts the player, it's never seen as such a big threat or danger. The player is easily able to dispatch of most of these enemies with no thought or really any question to it. Usually too, the game doesn't give much background or story to these bandits and just leaves you mindlessly eliminating them. Well, in today's video, we're going to focus on a quest which truly depicts that not all evil and sinister plans come from gods, supernatural beings, and those meddling in the dark arts. Today's quest up for discussion is titled, Caught in the Hunt. When the player finds themselves wandering through the city of Breville, they may hear rumors that the husband of Ursana Locke, Alaron, has gone missing. Many of the citizens say that she is extremely overcome by grief and is having a difficult time accepting the matter.
A local woman, Ursana Locke, has a missing husband. She might appreciate some help from someone like you.
What's more, Ursana tends to linger around the main gate to the city and might even approach the player while you're nearby. Looking for a new adventure and intrigued by the notion of a missing person, the player may choose to follow up with Ursana to receive more information on Alaron. Approaching Ursana and inquiring about her missing husband will enact the following dialogue.
I'm sorry to impose upon you like this, but I'm in need of assistance and I don't know what to do. My husband, Alaron, is missing. It all started when Alaron became foolish and started gambling. He'd visit the arena every week and spend our hard-earned money on bets. I told him to stop, but he didn't listen. He was certain he could win us a fortune and move us somewhere nicer, like the Imperial City. It didn't take long for Alaron to begin losing. He resorted to borrowing money from a usurer to cover his losses and placed new bets. As you can imagine, it didn't pay off. He ended up owing around 500 gold. We could never have that kind of money to pay back the usurer. Yesterday, the usurer, Cadlew Dragle, sent for my husband to meet him at the Lonely Suitor Lodge. He hasn't returned since. I fear for his life. Cadlew isn't known for his patience. Please, I'm not wealthy, but I'd give anything to see Alaron again. You will? Oh, thank you. Please be careful. I don't wish any harm to befall you either. I do miss him so. And when he gets back, I'm going to kill him for making me worry like this. Farewell and be careful. Cadlew is not to be trusted.
So it seems like her husband, Alaron, spent a lot of time gambling at the arena in order to gain more gold for the household. The overall goal was to make enough septims and move them to a nicer place like the Imperial City. Soon after, Alaron began losing his bets and resorted to borrowing money from a loan shark named Cadlew Dragle. Alaron continued to lose and couldn't afford to pay back Cadlew. Apparently, just yesterday, Cadlew sent for Alaron and instructed him to come to the Lonely Suitor Lodge for a meeting of sorts. Alaron has not been seen since then, and Ursana fears for his life. She has asked the player to investigate the matter for her, as she doesn't have the resources to go looking herself. The player agrees to the task and sets off to find Cadlew to ask some questions. Cadlew's usual loitering spot and last known location is the Lonely Suitor Lodge. The player heads to the southern half of the city and into the establishment. Lingering around the lodge, the player spots a big, unfriendly-looking orc clad in a set of armor and wielding a leveled two-handed weapon. Approaching and interacting with Cadlew, the following conversations ensued.
Yeah, what do you want? None of your damn business. I'd tell you if I liked you, and I don't. Maybe I know him, maybe I don't. But since you're so interested, I know something that could jar my memory. I just learned that a family heirloom, the axe of Dragol, which one of my stupid relatives lost, is located on Fort Grief Island in Nibbin Bay. My informant tell me it's hidden in the main keep at the center. Don't know what's guarding it, but I'm sure you can handle it. If you go there and bring it back to me, I'll tell you exactly where Alaron is. Then Alaron may not be coming home from his, journey for a very long time. Like permanently. Whenever you're ready, and it better be soon, I'll have a boat waiting for you to get to Fort Grief Island. Time's wasting. He's safe for now.
It's clear that Círdan has done something to Alaron in retaliation for his gambling loans. The only way that the player can find out any real information on Alaron is by accepting Círdan's request of going to a place called Fort Grief, which is apparently easily accessible by boat, and retrieving a family heirloom called the Axe of Dragol. The axe is hidden deep in the fort and apparently will require some fighting to get to. If the player refuses, Círdan implies that he will have Alaron killed.
Are you ready to go to the boat? Fine. I have it waiting for you at the dock next to the magic shop. Now get out of my sight. Yeah, it's a battle axe with the word Dragol carved into the haft. Huge. You can't miss it. I ain't gonna draw you a picture.
With all of that information, the player's only option is to hop on the boat headed for Fort Grief and retrieve the Axe of Dragol. The player arrives at the dock of the fort. The fort appears the same as any other throughout Cyrodiil. Approaching the front, the player will notice that the gate to go inside is locked. Located on the ground to the right is a switch that unlocks the entrance into said fort. Within the tower itself, there is blood sprayed on the cobblestones and skeletons littered along the floor. All of a sudden, a shocking image appears to the player. Standing amidst the carnage, dressed in fishing waders, is Alaron Locke himself. When he sees the player, he lets out an audible groan and begins talking.
It appears as though Círdan has tricked another poor soul with his axe story. You haven't guessed it yet? There never was any Axe of Dragol. It was just a ruse to lure you out here. I fell for the same trick. In my case, he told me if I retrieved the axe, he'd erase my debts. I was such an idiot to believe him. You're now the prey in Círdan's insane hunt, just like I am. And here we'll most likely die. Círdan doesn't make most of his money being a simple usurer. He also invented what he calls the Hunter's Run. People pay him a great deal of money to hunt and kill living human prey. No questions asked, and he takes care of the bodies. He uses the dungeons under Fort Grief as the hunting grounds. I was placed here because he knew someone would go looking for me. I'm sorry you got mixed up in all of this. I hope you can fight. It's our only chance of escaping alive. Don't bother. The door to this place is now locked. The only way to get out is by descending into the Hunter's Run and killing the hunters. One of them will have the key to the door. That's Círdan's rules. It's the only way we can win. I wish I could help more, but I can't fight. I've never held a weapon before in my life. Please, get us out of here. I'm not a rich man, but if we get out of here alive, I'll do what I can to reward you. Clever ruse. I wonder how many have died falling for it. Círdan is treacherous. Be wary, friend.
In a twisted and sick turn of events, the player has learned from Alaron Locke, whom we went all this way to the fort in order to receive information on, and has actually been held captive here the whole time, that we are now locked inside this fort with him. To make matters even worse, we are now part of some deranged game put on by Círdan that sees a victim, us and Alaron, hunted down, tortured, and killed by some high-rolling rich hunters who want to murder other humans. The only way to escape, according to Alaron, is by defeating the hunters within the fort in hopes of retrieving a key from their persons. Alaron cannot fight, so therefore it is up to the player to try and best all of the hunters. Accepting the situation and fully aware of the dangers that lie ahead, the player enters into the interior of the fort. Inside the fort, the player will have to make their way through maze-like paths that all appear in the same aesthetic. Along the way, you will encounter varieties of booby traps that range from falling into pits of spikes, activating poisonous gas tanks, and spiked swinging blocks chained to the ceiling. You will also spot the skeletal remains of previous victims scattered throughout the dungeons. More concerning, however, are the mobs and enemies that hide in the deepest, darkest spots within the dungeon. There are rats that will gang up on the player when spotted, but even worse are the hunters who lie in wait to catch the player off guard. Down here, the player will come face to face with different hunters whom have each paid their fair share in an attempt to torture and kill the player in Alarin. The hunters' nameplates show that they are an Imperial, a Nord, and an Orc. It is now up to the player to try and best these hunters in combat and fight to the death in the dungeons of Fort Grief. After defeating each hunter, the player will loot their bodies in an attempt to find keys in which unlock the next sections of the fort. Altogether, the fort has 2 sections, and once the player is successful in slaying the final key holder, who can be found within the second zone of the fort, they may now exit the blood-stained and battle-ridden ruin to tell Alarin the good news. Exiting the fort and coming back outside, the player looks up to see another shocking and heartbreaking sight. Círdan has killed Alarin and is standing over his body. Filled with rage and grief, the player runs up to Círdan, in which this dialogue will ensue.
I'm impressed that you killed all my clients. Doesn't matter. More will come along with their purses fat with gold and hearts lusting for blood. Too bad about Alarin. Didn't need him anymore now that you're here. At least now he's free of his debt. Do you really think I could afford to let you leave here? The key you found is a fake. No prey has ever left this island alive. And I aim to keep it that way. You were right about one thing, though. This is my game, and I'm changing the rules.
It is now that the player faces down Círdan in a fight to the death. Slaying Círdan will see Alarin avenged and putting an end to this twisted manhunt of a game arranged by the sinister Orc. However, dying will allow Círdan to continue his malicious activities, and no closure will be given to the Locke family. The duel ensues with both you and Círdan swinging, hacking, and slashing, each strike either being blocked or luckily absorbed by each other's ever-weakening armor. What was unseen before, however, is a Khajiit sharpshooter with a bow aiming down the player from the upper levels of the tower. It seems the odds are stacked against you, and an extra defense is needed if you're going to win the battle. With graceful and superior combat skills, the player bests and slays Círdan the Orc. Exhausted and cut up, the player uses what's left of their strength and endurance to reach the upper levels of the tower to defeat Rogera the Keen-Eye. With each arrow let loose, the player either blocks, dodges, or allows their armor to absorb the hit. With a few slashes and stabs, the player successfully bests Keen-Eye, eliminating all of the threats. It is here that the player loots the body of Círdan to find the real key, as Círdan said the one we have is a fake. Entering back into the fort, the player unlocks the door which holds the lever to unlocking the gate of the front. Turning the lever, exiting the interior, and fleeing the fort, the player hops back onto the boat and heads for the city of Breville. Once safely in the city, the player seeks out the now widowed Ursana Locke, and with a heavy heart, breaks the news.
Something's wrong, I can tell. What's happened to Alarin? When I saw the grave look on your face, I knew something had happened to him. And what of that fetcher, Círdan? Then Alarin's death has been avenged. I told him that the gambling would lead to this, that foolish man, but he never listened. Before you go, I have this for you. Alarin told me that if he ever got in trouble, this could be used to bail him out of jail. He'll not be needing it any longer, and I want you to have it. I'll not take no for an answer. I know you did all you could, and for that I thank you. Now please, go in peace. I wish to be alone.
It is now that Alarin and his whereabouts, although mercilessly killed, have been discovered, Círdan's evil game has been uncovered, foiled, and forever put to an end. Ursana Locke has closure on what happened to her husband, the player has been rewarded, and another quest has been logged as completed into the journal. Before we get to any theories on this quest, usually there is a bit of explanation that goes hand in hand at the end of these videos, but for Caught in the Hunt, it is rather self-explanatory for how everything ends. A vulnerable gambling addict goes through his family's savings and soon reaches out to a known usurer for a loan. The usurer takes advantage of this individual, knowing very well that the debt will not be paid off, and even worse, how they will further use them in an exploitative and evil way. The victim, Alarin, tries to make amends for his loan and falls for the trap of going to Fort Grief in search of an axe that never existed in the first place. It is here that Alarin becomes trapped inside of the fort and most likely hides to extend his life before being hunted down. The player is then tricked by Círdan into helping Alarin by also going to the fort in search of the axe, which, unbeknownst to Círdan, was a fatal mistake as he is unaware of the player's capabilities. The player defeats all of the hunters, but unfortunately sees Alarin cut down by Círdan in the process. It is here that we engage in a 2v1 fight that sees Círdan and the other hunter killed, the key to escaping is gained, and the player leaves Fort Grief to never return. At its heart, this quest is rather saddening as it plays into the crippling mindset of a gambling addict. Alarin needs just a bit more gold each time as he thinks the next bet will be the big win, and he will be able to bring his wife and him out of poverty and into the big city. Then we see this sinister and wrongful orc, Círdan, witness this weakness and spiraling mindset and sees to exploit it in one of the worst ways possible, to use Alarin's desperation in a game of life and death for hunting other humans. For starters, the victim of this game could be from one of two parties. The first ones are those who are indebted to Círdan. Given the city of Breville is looked at as one of the more less fortunate and lower class cities to live in, it makes sense that the victims have seen themselves fallen on hard financial times. Maybe not necessarily gambling problems like Alarin, but perhaps skooma addiction could be a factor in a lot of the loans being handed out, as Breville has a lot of skooma addicts and even a skooma den. It could also be as simple as there is less work or not substantial pay for a lot of the people living there. This is where Círdan would have preyed on those looking for a boost in septums, and the story of the Axe of Dragol was shared. Another occupation of the victims could have been that of treasure hunters and explorers. In fact, it might almost be easier to convince people who are willing to embrace challenge and risk to head into a dangerous fort in search of gold and rather a special axe. This idea sort of leads into the next one. A small and intriguing thought is that Alarin claims that Círdan is paid by the clients to take care of the bodies. However, how come we see a lot of skeletal remains throughout the fort, even in the most obvious of places? One idea is that maybe these are simply just the victims that Círdan missed, and the other bodies were indeed removed from the premises. However, that doesn't really account for the remains displayed out in the open. Recalling back to the idea that some of these victims could have been adventurers and treasure hunters, this leads to the notion that some of them likely had combat skills, as they would be needed within the ancient ruins and caves that they would be exploring. Also, the hunters whom the player had to defeat were fully equipped with armor, meaning that they thought a high degree of defense was necessary. What if the skeletons on the ground are actually a mixture of both hunters and victims alike? This would make sense too, as removing one simply clothed victim from the fort shouldn't be too tricky for Círdan to do. However, removing 2 or 3 or 4 dead bodies, some fully clad in heavy armor and massive weapons, would prove to be rather difficult and time consuming, especially if Círdan has to maintain his lone shark facade at the Lonely Suitor Lodge. I would even go as far as to say that the skeletal remains we see at Fort Grief might belong to the victims of the game, but the bodies that Círdan clears up are actually belonging to the hunters who have paid for the experience. After all, it's probably bad for business if your clients see a bunch of other dead clients. However, during our fight with Círdan, he did have an accomplice known as Rogera the Keen Eye. Rogera could just be another paying client, however, what if he's actually Círdan's partner and helps with disposing of the dead bodies? If this partnership is true, then it still remains unclear of who the skeletal remains belong to. Finally, the last theory I would like to put out there for today comes from user BarassMonkey17 on the Oblivion subreddit. The user theorized that Cadlew Chapel, one found off the Nibbin Bay, filled with mutilated corpses and the residence of necromancers, is actually the drop-off spot for where Círdan dumps the bodies of the game's victims. Assuming that the skeletal remains at Fort Grief are actually those of some hunters and not all are the victims, Círdan is allegedly paid to take care of the leftover remains. The theory goes that Círdan takes a boat across the Nibbin Bay from Fort Grief to Cadlew Chapel and leaves the bodies at the dock, knowing that there are those within the chapel who will at least keep them concealed and hidden. Whether or not it is a mutual arrangement or Círdan simply does it in secrecy is unknown. The user also goes on to state that the nameplate for one of the dead bodies inside the chapel is Dead Treasure Hunter. This would help corroborate with the idea that Círdan is indeed seeking out the expertise of treasure hunters who are actually tricked into becoming victims of the game. It is a very interesting and thought-provoking theory, and I would love to hear your thoughts on whether or not you believe it has merit. Overall, Caught in the Hunt is an amazing example of a quest that doesn't need the help of a higher power or powerful beings to enable an evil and twisted plan. It also shows that not every idea needs to be publicized and made into a spectacle for it to continue working. Sometimes, common mortal beings with a bit of coin purse and an idea are all it takes to invoke misery and distraught on the rest of the world.